Sarah Jenkins stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting her crisp navy blazer one last time. The early morning sunlight filtered through her Los Angeles apartment window, casting a warm glow on her dark skin. At 32, she had worked relentlessly to become one of the youngest marketing executives at Thompson and Brooks, and today's meeting in New York could be her biggest breakthrough yet. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "You've got this, baby girl? Show them what you're made of." Sarah smiled, remembering all the times her mother had worked double shifts as a nurse to put her through college. This success wasn't just hers, it belonged to both of them. The Uber ride to Lilacs was quiet, giving Sarah time to review her presentation one more time on her iPad. The driver, an elderly man with kind eyes, noticed her nervousness in the rearview mirror. "Big day ahead?" he asked. Sarah nodded, managing a small smile. "The biggest." At the airport, Sarah moved through security with practiced ease. Her carry-on contained everything she needed: laptop, presentation materials, and a change of clothes. She had learned early in her career to travel light and efficiently. The first-class lounge was relatively empty this morning, and she settled into a comfortable chair with a cup of green tea. As she waited for boarding to begin, Sarah couldn't help but notice the supple looks from other business travelers. She was used to it by now. Being often the only black woman in premium spaces still drew attention, even in 2025. She straightened her spine and kept her focus on her phone, scrolling through email updates from her team. Now boarding first-class passengers for Flight AA-203 to New York JFK. The announcement crackled over the speakers. Sarah gathered her belongings and headed to the gate. The gate agent's smile froze slightly as she scanned Sarah's boarding pass, doing a quick double-take between the ticket and her face. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor, having encountered this reaction countless times before. Walking down the jet bridge, Sarah mentally prepared herself for the next 6 hours. She had specifically chosen a first-class ticket to arrive fresh and ready for her presentation. The investment in herself was worth every penny, especially considering what was at stake. The first-class cabin was already buzzing with activity as passengers settled in. Sarah located her seat, 3A, a window position she had carefully selected. As she lifted her carry-on to the overhead compartment, she could hear whispered conversations pause briefly. Two middle-aged men in seats 4C and 4D watched her with poorly concealed surprise. Just as Sarah was about to take her seat, a flight attendant approached her. "Excuse me, miss," the attendant began with an uncertain tone. "Could I see your boarding pass again?" Sarah maintained her composure as she reached for her phone to display her digital ticket. Several passengers were now openly watching the interaction. Behind her, someone was making their way down the aisle, someone whose presence would soon change the entire dynamic of the flight. But for now, Sarah focused on maintaining her dignity as she proved, yet again, that she belonged in this space. The flight attendant, looking slightly embarrassed after verifying the ticket, quickly moved on to other tasks. Sarah finally sat down, her heart beating a little faster than she would have liked. She pulled out her phone to text her best friend Monica. "Another day, another microaggression. But I'm not letting anything stop me today." As other passengers continued boarding, Sarah could hear snippets of conversation from the two men behind her. "Must be some kind of mistake," one muttered to the other. "These tickets aren't cheap." Sarah took a deep breath and pulled out her noise-canceling headphones. She had learned long ago to choose her battles wisely. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the last passengers boarded. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. When she opened them, she noticed someone famous walking down the aisle, someone whose unexpected intervention would turn this routine flight into a powerful moment of change. Little did Sarah know that in the next few hours, her story would become one that would inspire conversations about privilege, respect, and human dignity across social media. But for now, she was just another professional woman trying to do her job, unaware that she was about to become part of something much bigger than a business trip to New York. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Sarah tried to focus on her presentation notes, but the whispered comments from behind her grew increasingly difficult to ignore. The two men, both wearing expensive suits and gold watches, had been exchanging remarks just loud enough for her to hear through her headphones. "First class isn't what it used to be," one of them said, adjusting his tie with manicured fingers. "They're letting anyone in these days." His companion chuckled, the sound both smug and unpleasant. Sarah's fingers tightened around her iPad. Years of experience had taught her how to handle these situations, but it never got easier. She thought about her mother's words from that morning. Show them what you're made of. Taking a deep breath, she straightened in her seat and removed her headphones, deciding that pretending not to hear wasn't the answer today. The flight attendant, different from the one who had questioned her boarding pass, came by with drink orders. "Would you like anything from the bar, ma'am?" she asked Sarah with genuine warmth. Before Sarah could answer, one of the men behind her spoke up. "Hey, sweetheart," he called to the flight attendant, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think there might be some confusion. Isn't first class supposed to have certain standards?" He emphasized the last word while staring pointedly at Sarah. The flight attendant's smile became fixed. "Sir, all our passengers in first class are here because they purchased first class tickets. Now, what would you like to drink?" Her professional tone carried an edge of steel. Sarah turned slightly, making eye contact with the man who had spoken. "I'll have a sparkling water with lime, please," she said clearly, her voice steady. "And I'd be happy to explain to these gentlemen exactly how I afforded this ticket. Through hard work and professional success, just like anyone else here." The men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting her to address them directly. The first man, who wore a red tie, leaned forward. "Listen, we're just saying that some places have certain traditions, certain expectations." "I think what my colleague means," the second man interrupted, attempting to sound more diplomatic, "is that first class used to be more exclusive." Other passengers were now watching the exchange with varying degrees of discomfort. A woman across the aisle buried her face in a magazine. A businessman 2 rows ahead pretended to be deeply engrossed in his laptop screen. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Sarah felt her heart racing, but kept her voice calm. "I'm a marketing executive heading to New York for a major client presentation. I chose first class because I value comfort and efficiency in my business travel. I'm curious, what exactly about that doesn't meet your expectations?" The men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The one in the red tie opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a quiet yet authoritative voice came from a few rows behind. "I'd like to change seats, if possible." The cabin fell silent as Keanu Reeves stood up from his seat in 6A. The actor, dressed casually in black jeans and a dark jacket, had been so low-key that few passengers had even noticed him boarding. Now, all eyes were on him as he gathered his book and water bottle. The flight attendant, who had been standing nearby with Sarah's sparkling water, quickly nodded. "Of course, Mr. Reeves. There's an empty seat right here." She gestured to 3B, the seat next to Sarah. As Keanu moved to the front, the two men behind Sarah suddenly became very interested in their phones. The transformation in their behavior was immediate and striking, from confrontational to embarrassed in seconds. Keanu settled into the seat next to Sarah, offering her a genuine smile. "I hope you don't mind some company," he said quietly. "I couldn't help overhearing, and I thought maybe we could all have an interesting conversation about what really makes someone belong somewhere." Sarah felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, relief, and a renewed sense of strength. She hadn't needed rescuing, but having someone actively choose to stand beside her, especially someone of Keanu's stature, sent a powerful message to everyone in the cabin. The flight attendant served Sarah's sparkling water with lime, adding an extra lime wedge with a supportive wink. What had started as another uncomfortable confrontation was about to transform into something none of the passengers would ever forget. Keanu settled comfortably into his new seat, his presence creating a noticeable shift in the cabin's atmosphere. He turned to Sarah with genuine interest in his eyes. "I hear you're in marketing," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the now silent men behind them. "What kind of projects do you work on?" Sarah, still processing the unexpected turn of events, found herself relaxing as she described her work at Thompson and Brooks. "We're actually pitching to a major entertainment company tomorrow," she explained. "They're looking to revamp their entire digital strategy." "You know," Keanu responded thoughtfully, "I've seen how marketing has completely transformed in the entertainment industry over the past decade. The digital space has changed everything." He spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had spent decades in the business. The flight attendant returned with fresh drinks for everyone, including the two men behind them, who now sat uncomfortably quiet, their earlier bravado completely deflated. One of them kept glancing at his phone, likely Googling both Keanu and how to disappear into thin air. As Sarah and Keanu continued their conversation, other passengers began listening in. A young woman across the aisle removed her earbuds. An elderly gentleman 2 rows ahead turned slightly in his seat, clearly interested in their discussion about the evolution of digital marketing in Hollywood. The biggest challenge, Sarah was saying, animated by the genuine interest Keanu showed, is helping traditional companies understand that diversity isn't just about checking boxes. It's about connecting with real audiences who have real purchasing power. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. You know, I've seen this firsthand in film. When studios finally started telling more diverse stories, they were surprised to find out these niche films could become global blockbusters. He paused, then added with a slight smile, sometimes people need to be reminded that talent and excellence come in all forms. The comment hung in the air, its meaning clear to everyone in earshot. One of the men behind them cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Excuse me," he said, his voice notably humbler than before. I feel like I need to apologize for my earlier behavior." He leaned forward slightly in his seat. "Miss Jenkins, what I said was inappropriate and prejudiced. I'm sorry." Sarah turned in her seat to face him, meeting his eyes steadily. The man looked genuinely ashamed, his earlier arrogance replaced by real remorse. His companion shifted in his seat before adding his own apology. Keanu watched the exchange quietly, his presence serving as a catalyst for this moment of reflection and change. When the men finished speaking, he spoke up. "You know what I love about flying?" he asked, addressing everyone within earshot. "For a few hours, we're all just people sharing the same space, heading somewhere together. Maybe that's a good time to examine our preconceptions about who belongs where." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. The elderly gentleman ahead turned fully around now. "I've been in business for 40 years, he offered, and I've learned that the most dangerous phrase in any industry is "that's how it's always been done." The conversation began to flow more freely. The young woman across the aisle shared her own experiences as an Asian American in tech. Even the flight attendant, during a quiet moment, spoke about the changes she'd seen in passenger demographics over her 15 years of service. Sarah found herself in the middle of exactly the kind of meaningful dialogue she tried to create in her marketing campaigns: authentic, challenging, and ultimately transformative. She pulled out her phone and made a few quick notes. This experience, though initially painful, was providing perfect material for tomorrow's presentation about authentic representation and changing narratives. Keanu noticed her taking notes and smiled. "Sometimes the best inspiration comes from real life," he said quietly. As the conversation continued, Sarah noticed the 2 men behind them were now actively participating, sharing their own realizations about unconscious bias and privilege. Their transformation seemed genuine, sparked by the combination of shame at their behavior and Keanu's graceful handling of the situation. The flight was only halfway to New York, but already the first-class cabin had become an impromptu forum for discussing change, prejudice, and progress. Sarah caught her reflection in the window. She was smiling, realizing that sometimes the most powerful presentations about changing narratives happen far from any boardroom. The conversation in first class had evolved into something remarkable. As the plane cruised over the Midwest, Keanu shared a story from his early days in Hollywood, when he'd witnessed discrimination against a fellow actor. "The interesting thing," he said, his voice thoughtful, "wasn't just the prejudice itself, but how many people stayed silent because they were uncomfortable speaking up." He turned to address the entire cabin. "Sometimes being an ally means stepping out of your comfort zone." The man in the red tie, who had been one of Sarah's initial harassers, leaned forward. "I keep thinking about my daughter," he admitted, his voice heavy with realization. "She's studying business at Howard University. If someone treated her the way I treated you, Ms. Jenkins," he trailed off, shaking his head. Sarah took a sip of her water, considering his words. "The goal isn't to make people feel guilty," she said. "It's to create understanding. In my marketing work, we often find that people want to do better. They just don't always know how." A businesswoman in her 50s, sitting across from them, joined the discussion. "I remember being the only woman in board meetings 20 years ago," she shared. "It's better now, but we still have so far to go with real inclusion." The flight attendant, passing through with fresh drinks, paused briefly. "Would anyone like to hear something interesting?" she asked. When several passengers nodded, she continued, In the past 5 years, I've seen a complete change in our first-class demographics. It's becoming more diverse every year, and you know what? Our customer satisfaction scores have actually improved. Keanu smiled at this information. Change often brings out the best in people once they get past their initial resistance. He turned to Sarah. Would you mind sharing a bit about your presentation tomorrow? It seems relevant to this whole discussion. Sarah pulled out her iPad, feeling more confident than ever about her pitch. We're proposing a complete overhaul of how this entertainment company approaches digital marketing. Our research shows that authentic representation isn't just morally right, it's good business. The cabin listened intently as she shared some key statistics about buying power across different demographics. Even the second harasser, who had been quiet for a while, was taking notes on his phone. The numbers don't lie, Sarah explained, but what really matters are the stories behind them. Every time someone sees themselves represented authentically in media or advertising, it creates a ripple effect. The elderly gentleman who had spoken earlier raised his hand slightly. I have a question, if you don't mind. How do companies avoid making their diversity efforts feel forced or tokenistic? This sparked a new round of discussion, with passengers sharing examples of both successful and failed attempts at inclusion in various industries. Keanu occasionally added insights from his decades in entertainment, while Sarah provided perspective from the marketing world. The man in the red tie, whose name they now knew was Richard, shared how his daughter's experiences at Howard had begun changing his perspective even before today. But sometimes, he admitted, our unconscious biases run deeper than our conscious beliefs. That's exactly why conversations like this matter, Sarah responded. Real change happens person by person, moment by moment. As they passed through some light turbulence, the flight attendant requested that everyone fasten their seatbelts. During this brief pause in the discussion, Sarah noticed something remarkable. The entire first-class cabin had become united in conversation. The invisible barriers that often divided passengers had dissolved. Keanu used this moment to share something personal. You know, he said quietly, I've always believed that the most important scenes in movies aren't the big action sequences. They're the quiet moments where characters truly see each other for the first time. The turbulence passed, but the metaphor lingered. Sarah looked around the cabin, amazed at how a potentially ugly situation had transformed into something powerful and meaningful. The flight tracker showed they were about halfway to New York. What had started as an all-too-familiar experience of discrimination had become something else entirely, a masterclass in human connection and growth. Sarah opened a new note on her iPad. Tomorrow's presentation might need some updates to include the lessons from this extraordinary flight. What none of them knew yet was that the most powerful part of their journey was still to come, as the conversation would soon turn to practical actions and real-world changes they could all make in their respective spheres of influence. As the flight continued eastward, the conversation shifted from awareness to action. A flight attendant brought around a fresh round of drinks and small snacks, creating a conference-like atmosphere in the first-class cabin. Theory is important, Sarah said, pulling up some slides on her iPad. But what really matters is what we do with this understanding. She showed a graph demonstrating how companies with diverse leadership consistently outperformed their competitors. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. In film, we've seen similar results. Some of the highest-grossing movies in recent years succeeded precisely because they broke away from traditional casting and storytelling patterns. Richard, the man in the red tie who had earlier apologized for his behavior, raised his hand. I'm on the board of several companies, he said, his voice carrying a new humility. What specific steps should we be taking to create real change? The businesswoman across the aisle, who they now knew as Patricia Chen, jumped in. I can speak to this, she said. In my company, we implemented blind resume screening and standardized interview questions. The improvement in our talent pool was immediate. The cabin had become an impromptu workshop on practical inclusion strategies. Sarah found herself taking notes just as often as she was sharing insights. The elderly gentleman, a retired professor named Dr. Williams, shared stories about how his university had transformed its admission processes. But the real challenge, Keanu observed, isn't just changing policies. It's changing hearts and minds. He turned to Sarah. How do you address that in your marketing strategies? Sarah clicked to another slide on her iPad. We found that personal stories are the most powerful tool for creating empathy and understanding. When people see themselves, or their children, their friends, their colleagues, in these stories, that's when real change begins. The second man who had harassed Sarah earlier, whose name was Thomas, spoke up for the first time in a while. I keep thinking about all the times I've been in hiring positions, he admitted. How many talented people did I overlook because of my own biases? The conversation paused briefly as the plane encountered some light chop. During this moment, Sarah noticed something remarkable. Several passengers were recording notes on their phones or laptops, treating this impromptu discussion like a valuable business seminar. When the turbulence settled, Patricia shared her screen with Sarah, showing a diversity initiative she was planning for her tech company. Would you mind taking a look at this? She asked. I feel like it could be stronger. As Sarah reviewed the document, other passengers began sharing their own workplace experiences and challenges. The flight attendant, during her breaks, added valuable insights about how their airline had evolved its customer service training to be more inclusive. Keanu watched all this with quiet satisfaction. You know what's powerful about this moment? He asked the cabin. We're not just talking about change, we're actively planning it. Each person here has the power to influence their own sphere. Richard pulled out his business card and handed it to Sarah. I mean it about wanting your perspective on our board diversity, he said. This conversation has made me realize we need to do much more than just tick boxes. The energy in the cabin was electric with possibility. Passengers were exchanging contact information, making notes, and forming impromptu mentorship connections. What had started as an ugly incident of discrimination was transforming into a catalyst for real change. Sarah found herself drawing up a quick framework on her iPad, a simple but powerful tool for organizations to assess their current diversity efforts and identify gaps. Other passengers leaned in to see, offering suggestions and refinements. The beauty of this moment, Keanu observed, is that it shows how change can happen anywhere, even at 35,000 feet. He smiled at Sarah. Sometimes the most powerful presentations aren't the ones we plan. As they passed the 3-hour mark of their flight, Sarah realized that her presentation for tomorrow had evolved into something far more powerful than her original pitch. She now had real stories, practical insights, and even potential allies in the room. The flight tracker showed they were crossing into the Eastern time zone. The cabin had become more than just a first-class section. It was now an incubator for change, a place where biases were being confronted and new understandings were taking root. What none of them realized yet was that their impromptu mid-air conference was about to spark changes that would reach far beyond their individual spheres of influence. As the plane began its gradual descent into the New York area, the conversation in first class took an even more personal turn. The sunset painted the cabin in warm orange hues as passengers began sharing deeper stories about their own journeys with prejudice and understanding. I need to tell you something, Ms. Jenkins, Richard said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. When my daughter first told me she was going to Howard instead of Yale, I was disappointed. He paused, visibly uncomfortable with the admission. Now I realize that reaction came from my own prejudices. Watching her thrive there has been transformative for our entire family. Sarah nodded, understanding the courage it took to admit such things publicly. Change often starts at home, she replied. Sometimes it takes seeing someone we love face barriers to recognize those barriers exist. Keanu, who had been quietly observing for a while, shared a story from his early career. I once lost a role because I was considered too ethnic-looking, he revealed. The interesting thing is, years later, that same director apologized to me. He said that moment had forced him to examine his own biases about what a leading man should look like. The flight attendant, returning with landing preparation instructions, added her own observation. In my 15 years of flying, this is the most meaningful conversation I've ever witnessed in first class, she said. Usually, everyone just works on their laptops or sleeps. Thomas, the second man who had harassed Sarah earlier, pulled out his phone and showed the cabin a photo of his management team. Looking at this now, I can see the problem, he said. It's like looking in a mirror. Everyone looks exactly the same. Patricia Chen shared her screen again, this time showing an email she had just drafted to her company's HR department. I'm proposing immediate changes to our recruitment process, she explained. This conversation has made me realize we've been doing the bare minimum. Dr. Williams, the retired professor, offered his perspective. What's remarkable about this discussion is that it's moved beyond theory into actual commitments to change. That's rare. Sarah opened her presentation one more time, making final adjustments based on the insights from the flight. She noticed several passengers taking photos of her contact information displayed on the screen, including executives from companies she had been trying to connect with for months. The plane hit some turbulence as they descended through clouds, causing a brief pause in the conversation. During this moment, Sarah noticed Keanu writing something in a small notebook. When she caught his eye, he smiled. "I've been taking notes for my next production meeting," he explained. "These conversations about representation matter just as much in front of the camera as they do in corporate boardrooms." Richard cleared his throat. "I've been texting with my daughter," he admitted, showing his phone. "I told her about my behavior today and what I learned. She's proud of me for owning up to it." The cabin fell quiet as the plane began its final approach into JFK. The Manhattan skyline glittered in the distance, a reminder of the business world they were about to re-enter. But something had changed during this flight. Connections had been made, perspectives had shifted, and real commitments to change had been voiced. "Before we land," Patricia said, "I think we should create some way to stay connected. These conversations shouldn't end when we touch down." Sarah quickly created a LinkedIn group, and passengers began joining one by one. Even the flight attendant asked to be included, recognizing the value of the network being formed. Keanu watched this organization taking shape with approval. "Sometimes the most meaningful changes start in the most unexpected places," he observed. "Like a first-class cabin over the Midwest." As the landing gear deployed with a thud, Sarah looked around at the faces that had transformed from strangers, and in some cases, antagonists, into allies and connections. The man who had questioned her presence in first class was now asking for her input on his company's diversity initiatives. The woman who had hidden behind her magazine earlier was now sharing her email address. The pilot's voice came over the intercom announcing their final descent into JFK. But for everyone in first class, this landing felt more like a beginning than an ending. What had started as an ugly incident of bias had transformed into something none of them could have predicted. A catalyst for real change in their respective spheres of influence. What they didn't know yet was that their impromptu mid-air conference would have ripple effects far beyond their individual companies and industries. As the plane touched down at JFK, Sarah's phone began buzzing with LinkedIn notifications. The network they had created mid-flight was already growing as passengers connected with each other and shared their commitments to change. "My car's waiting," Richard announced as they taxied to the gate. "But before I go, I'd like to invite you to speak at our next board meeting, Ms. Jenkins. Your insights today were invaluable." He handed her his business card. He was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Keanu gathered his things unhurriedly, watching as the impromptu community they built continued to solidify even as the plane reached the gate. "You know what's remarkable?" he said to Sarah. "This started as one person standing up to bias, and now look what it's becoming." The flight attendant approached their row with tears in her eyes. "In 20 years of flying, I've never seen anything like this," she said. "I've already messaged our corporate office about what happened here today. They want to hear more." As passengers began to stand and retrieve their luggage, Thomas stepped forward with his phone. "I just got off a text exchange with our VP of Human Resources," he said, showing Sarah his screen. "We'd like to hire your firm to overhaul our entire corporate culture program." Patricia Chen was busy typing on her laptop. "I'm drafting a proposal for my board right now," she explained. "We need to completely rethink our approach to inclusion. Sarah, would you be willing to consult?" The elderly Dr. Williams smiled as he watched the exchanges. "Sometimes the most powerful lessons happen outside the classroom," he observed. "This flight should be a case study in how change happens." Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with an email from her boss. She had sent a quick message during the flight about the unexpected developments, and his response was enthusiastic. "This is exactly the kind of innovative approach we've been looking for. Come straight to the office when you land." As they declined, Keanu pulled Sarah aside. "I have a proposition for you," he said quietly. "I'm producing a documentary series about transformative moments in corporate America. Would you be interested in sharing this story?" The jetway was buzzing with continued conversation as passengers exchanged final contact information and made plans for follow-up meetings. The two flight attendants stood at the exit, beaming as they watched their first-class cabin transform into what felt like a graduation ceremony. "Check your email," Richard called out as he headed toward baggage claim. "My assistant will be in touch about that board meeting. And Sarah, thank you for teaching me something valuable today." In the terminal, Sarah noticed that several passengers had paused their rush to connections or ground transportation, instead gathering in a small group to continue their discussion. Patricia was showing everyone the draft of her proposal on her laptop screen. "I'd never seen anything like this," one of the flight attendants whispered to her colleague. "They usually can't get off the plane fast enough." Keanu lingered with the group, his celebrity status now secondary to his role as a participant in their transformation. "Real change happens person by person," he reminded them. "What matters is what we do next." Sarah's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. LinkedIn requests, email notifications, text messages. The network they had built was already expanding as passengers shared their experience with colleagues and friends. Thomas, who had been one of her initial harassers, approached her one last time. "My daughter's graduating from business school next month," he said. "Would you consider being her mentor? She needs to hear your story." As the group finally began to disperse, heading toward various terminals and exits, Sarah stood for a moment, taking it all in. Her presentation tomorrow now felt like just the beginning of something much larger. A notification popped up on her phone. The LinkedIn group they had created mid-flight had already grown to over 50 members as passengers added colleagues and friends. The description read, "Born at 35,000 feet, a movement for real change in corporate America." Keanu's words echoed in her mind as she headed toward the taxi stand. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen in the most unexpected places. What none of them realized yet was that their story was about to spread far beyond their newly formed network, catalyzing changes in boardrooms and offices across the country. The transformation that had begun in first class was just taking off. 3 months after the remarkable flight, Sarah stood at the podium of a major business conference in Chicago. The audience of over 1,000 executives listened intently as she shared the story of what had become known as the first-class revolution. In the front row, Richard and Thomas sat with their entire executive teams. Their companies had undergone dramatic transformations since that flight. Richard's board now had 40% diverse representation, while Thomas had completely restructured his hiring practices. Keanu's documentary series about the flight had just premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, earning critical acclaim for its honest portrayal of how change happens in corporate America. The flight attendant who had witnessed it all was now traveling the country, training airline staff on inclusive customer service. Patricia Chen stepped onto the stage to join Sarah. "Our tech company's demographics have shifted significantly in just 3 months," she announced, showing their latest diversity statistics. "But more importantly, our innovation metrics have never been higher." The LinkedIn group they had started on the plane had exploded to over 10,000 members, all sharing stories and strategies for creating more inclusive workplaces. Dr. Williams had developed a case study about the flight that was now being taught at leading business schools. Sarah's marketing firm had grown exponentially, with companies across the country seeking their expertise in authentic representation and inclusive marketing. The presentation she had originally prepared for that New York meeting seemed almost quaint now, compared to what had evolved. But the real story, Sarah continued, isn't in the numbers. It's in the individual changes. She clicked to the next slide, showing a photo of Richard's daughter graduating from Howard. It's about parents seeing their children's world through new eyes. The conference hall buzzed as Sarah shared screenshots of internal company memos, policy changes, and transformation initiatives that had all sprouted from that single flight. Thomas's company had created a mentorship program that was already being replicated across industries. Keanu, who had flown in specifically for this session, took the stage next. "What happened on that flight wasn't magic," he said. "It was simply people choosing to listen and learn, rather than defend and deny." The flight attendant who had witnessed it all was now the airline's chief diversity officer, implementing changes that were transforming the entire industry's approach to customer service and employee relations. Sarah's phone lit up with a message. The newly formed First Class Initiative, a nonprofit organization born from their mid-air discussion, had just received major funding to expand its corporate transformation programs nationwide. The most powerful moment, Sarah told the audience, wasn't when bias was confronted. It was when people chose to change. She showed a series of photographs: Richard mentoring young professionals of color, Thomas's diverse new management team, Patricia's tech company winning awards for inclusion. The conference organizers had set up a special surprise. On large screens, they showed live video feeds from companies across the country where the first-class revolution had sparked change. Offices, boardrooms, and workplaces where conversations about inclusion had moved from theory to practice. Keanu's documentary team captured it all, recording what would become the final scene of their series. The story had come full circle, from a confrontation in first class to a movement transforming corporate America. But we're not done, Sarah concluded, her voice firm. This is just the beginning. She revealed the launch of a national initiative, backed by major corporations, to create systematic change in how companies approach diversity and inclusion. As the audience rose for a standing ovation, Sarah caught sight of her mother in the crowd, tears streaming down her face. The woman who had worked double shifts to put her daughter through college was watching that investment transform not just their lives, but countless others. The conference would continue for 2 more days, but this session, this story, would be what everyone remembered. A reminder that change can start anywhere, even in a first-class cabin at 35,000 feet. As Sarah left the stage, her phone buzzed with a message from the airline. They wanted her to help design a new training program called the First Class Standard. Not about seating categories, but about treating every human being with first-class respect. The story that had begun with harassment had transformed into a movement of hope and change. And somewhere over the Midwest, on the same route where it all began, another flight was taking off, carrying the possibility of more transformative conversations yet to come.